Shavua Tov. Today we read about Emor, Parashat Emor, which deals with the laws of the priests, the Kohanim, their sanctity, their status, the rules relating to whom they are allowed to marry, who they are not allowed to marry, the prohibition upon them becoming defiled to the dead, and the exceptions to that rule, and so forth and so on. And I was going to discuss the order of the chapters of the book of Leviticus, because Emor seems to be out of place. However, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But because of the events of Lag BaOmer and Meron, I wanted to explore another concept as well in their memory. And that is, for the period of time that we find ourselves, the Sfirat Omer, between Pesach and Shavuot, it's a time of sadness. At the beginning of Sfirat Omer, the question is raised, why don't we recite the blessing of Shehechianu, who has kept us alive till this joyous day? Because whenever we have a mitzvah that hasn't come around for a year, when it comes, we're supposed to say that blessing, but for Sfirat Omer we don't. And there are a number of halachic reasons why we don't. However, there's also an emotional reason, and that is because the period of time of Sfirat Omer carries in it some tragedies. It started with the students of Rabbi Yakiva, the great Talmudic sage, whose 12,000 pairs of students died in a plague during this period of time. And it continued to the Crusades, when the holy martyrs of the communities of Speyer, of Worms, and of Mainz were attacked by the Crusaders, in some cases killed, in other cases they took their own lives and the lives of their children in order to prevent them from being forcibly converted to Christianity. And that all happened again during the period of time between Pesach and Shavuot, the time when we're counting the Omer. And now, tragically, we must add the events of Meron on Lag BaOmer this year, when people lost their lives in the performance of a mitzvah trying to become closer to Hashem, and yet they were taken. So, because of all this emotional baggage, the rabbis made this blessing of Shechianu to be recited with great joy. And if a person cannot feel the joy, so then they can't really recite the blessing. It's not appropriate, and that's the emotional reason why we don't recite Shechianu on the mitzvah of Sfirat HaOmer. Now, let's take a look at the order of the Parshas, indeed, because there is a question about them. There's a humorous way of looking at the order of the Parshas. They give us a lesson to explain why it is how a person who nobody likes when they're alive, but when they're gone, all of a sudden everybody is eulogizing, oh, what a holy person. And that's the names of the Parshas. Tazria, Metzora, when he's alive, he's like a Metzora, like a leper. Acharei Mot, but after he dies, Kedoshim Emor, will say that they're holy. Those are the names of the Parshas. And the story is told about Mickey Rooney quipped. There was a very famous Hollywood producer, I won't mention any names, who nobody liked. Everybody hated the guy's guts. But when he died, there were thousands of people at his funeral. So Mickey Rooney quipped, you see, you give the people what they want, and they turn out. Well, tragically this year, we just need to take those last three. Acharei Mot, Kedoshim Emor, after they have passed, we will say they are holy, because indeed the people at Meron who passed away were indeed quite holy. But we will discuss that. But the question is, why is it that during this period of time of the year, such tragedies occurred? The students of Rabbi Yakiva were holy. They were, even though the Talmud gives a reason why they died, that they didn't treat each other with respect, but if they wouldn't have been holy, if they wouldn't have been so special, we wouldn't be mourning for them. The whole Jewish people for centuries would not be observing semi-mourning during this period of time, Sfirat HaOmer, if they weren't important. So why did it happen at this particular time of the year? The holy martyrs of the Crusades, why at this particular time of the year? What is it about Sfirat HaOmer? And it's not Sfirat HaOmer per se, but it's the time of the year that makes these kinds of things happen. Let's take a look in our Parsha to perhaps gain a deeper understanding. Our Parsha talks about the significance of the Kohanim, of the priests, as we mentioned, whom they're allowed to marry, whom not, the fact that they can't become defiled to the dead except for certain relatives and under certain circumstances, and so forth. One of the things that we read in the Parsha is the mitzvah of v'kidashto, to sanctify the Kohanim, to sanctify the priests. And the rabbis learn from this that whenever you have a ceremony of holiness, the Kohen is supposed to get first dibs. Is supposed to be honored first. And so it is with Kriyas HaTorah, when we read the Torah in the synagogue, the Kohen is supposed to get the first Aliyah, and then because once you have the Kohen, then afterwards you have the Levi, who is the assistant to the Kohen, who gets the second Aliyah. The question is raised, can a Kohen forego the honor? Can they say, I'm a Kohen, I'm supposed to have the first Aliyah, but you know what, let someone else take it today. And the answer is yes and no. In theory, it is possible. A Kohen has the right to be mochel, to forgive or forego his honor. But the Talmud says that if there are a lot of people coming to the synagogue, as happens on Sabbaths and holidays, so then the Kohen is not allowed. Why? To avoid fighting. How so? What would the case be? Well, imagine, let's say on one week you have a bar mitzvah. Berkowitz's family is having the bar mitzvah. And they would like to have all of the aliyahs to give to all of their relatives who came in from overseas. So Aaron Cohen says, fine, you know what, I don't need to have my aliyah today. Fine, Berkowitz take the first aliyah, and once he gives them the first, they get the second as well, because if the Cohen doesn't go up, then you don't have to call a Levi as well either. So the next week, it's Goldberg's bar mitzvah, and this time Aaron Cohen says, you know, I really need to insist on the Kohen aliyah today. So then Goldberg's going to say, hey, how come you gave your aliyahs to Berkowitz, but to me you don't? And you'll have a fight. Now, why is that bad? Well, obviously fighting is bad, but the rabbis in order to prevent that, they said a Kohen may not forego their first aliyah. They must take the first aliyah. And you know, the custom that some have today of having the Kohen walk out of the room is really not so recommended, because the result could still be the same thing. How come you walked out of the room for Berkowitz and you didn't do it for me? So really the Kohen should stay and should receive the aliyah, even if they get the aliyah every single week. Now, why is that so important? Because let's look at who the Kohen is. The Kohen, the Mishnah says in Avot, that we are supposed to be the students of Aharon HaKohen. What was his defining characteristic? Ohev Shalom Rodef Shalom Ohevet Habayot Mekorban Torah. He loved peace. He pursued peace. He loved people and brought them close to Torah. In other words, the Kohen is supposed to be a person of peace. And if the Kohen is going to be causing arguments, well, that's completely inappropriate, because that's not who he is. And I think that is the lesson to learn from the Kohen, that we all need to be who we are. And the period of time that we find ourselves of, Sfirat Omer, is the time when we become who we are. It's the time when we left slavery in Egypt with nothing, no identity, no property, nothing, slaves. And we're going to become, at Mount Sinai, a Mamlechet Kohanim and a Goy Kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We're gaining an identity. And we need to live up to that identity. When Moses stood before God at the burning bush, and he was doubting his own ability, doubting who he is, by asking for somebody to come with him to help him out, that's when God got angry. Now the rabbis teach us that God is particular with those that are closest to him, like chut ha'se'ara, like the thread of a hair. In other words, the closer, the higher the person is on the ladder of spirituality, the more dangerous it becomes if they slip, and God is particular especially. Even Moses himself didn't escape this when he was on his way back to Egypt and failed to circumcise his son. God was ready to kill him, even though he had been sent on this very important mission, because God is especially careful. And we see from here an obligation on every individual to be who we are at our best, and not to sell ourselves short. So the students of Rabbi Yakiva were certainly very great. If they weren't very great, we wouldn't be mourning for them. And yet the Talmud says that they didn't show respect to each other. In other words, they didn't live up to who they were, the students of Rabbi Yakiva. And God, especially at this time of the year, which is when we must be strengthening our identity, says if you're not going to be who you are, then existence doesn't befit you. Physical existence in this world doesn't befit you. The martyrs of the Crusades teach us this in such a powerful and poignant way, because in this week's Parsha we have the commandment to be ready to give one's life for the sanctification of God's name, limsor nefesh, to hand over one's soul. And the halacha requires it, the Torah requires it in the case of 3 commandments. If somebody holds a gun up to someone's head and says, worship idols or I shoot, the person must say, shoot. And if someone holds a gun up to one's head and says, have this illicit relationship with a married woman, with one of the other prohibited sexual relationships, the person has to say, shoot. And if the person says, kill this other Jew or else I shoot, the person has to say shoot. For those 3 commandments, for idolatry, for sexual sins, and for murder, one is not allowed to violate those things. Any other commandment, if they come and say, eat a cheeseburger, so you can say, okay, put ketchup on it. But anyway, for the big 3 though, no. And I have to point out that my teacher, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, pointed out that this is a last resort. Obviously, it's an extreme circumstance that we should never know from. But that doesn't mean that the commandment to sanctify God's name, and the source for this commandment to give one's life in these three circumstances comes from the verse, V'nigdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, I shall be sanctified in the midst of the Jewish people. So Rav Aaron says this is a mitzvah that one can fulfill by living. We say in the Psalms, Lo amut ki echyeh v'asaper ma'aseh ka. I shall not die, yea, I shall live and tell the deeds of the Lord. So by living on the sanctification of God's name, by living an example that causes others to say, look at this person, this Jew, who lives on such a high ethical and spiritual plane, I would like to be like them. That is a fulfillment of sanctification of God's name. And that's the way we should only have to do it. And it shouldn't come to the other one as well. At any rate, but the martyrs of the Crusades, they realized that if they didn't take their own lives in many cases, they would be forcibly, and their children would be forcibly converted to Christianity. They'd be forcibly brought into a world of idolatry, because Christianity is either idolatry or close to it. It is certainly impossible for a Jew to be a Christian and to be a Jew at the same time. It cannot coexist. And so the people, basically, the mitzvah is saying, basically, you are a Jew. You are a part of the nation of God of Israel. You do not worship idols. You do not commit murder. And you do not destroy the sanctity of the family. And if somebody forces you to do that, that would be living a life that is not you. It's not being who you are. And that such a life is not worth living. So therefore, the martyrs taught us that lesson in such a tragic and heart-wrenching way, that life not as a Jew is not worth living. And that's the message of this period of time, to be who we are. Now, we also, I feel that we also connected to the Parsha of Shmini, because the Parsha of Shmini tells the story of the great day that everybody was looking forward to, the sanctification, the inauguration of the sanctuary in the wilderness. People had given their gold and silver and all of their artwork and skills to build this beautiful, beautiful tabernacle. And now was the day it was going to be opened, a day that gained crowns of glory. And what happened on that day? Tragedy struck. The two sons of Aharon HaKohen, Nadav and Avihu, brought incense and brought a fire that they were not commanded, and they perished before the Lord. Now, were they not holy? Were they sinners? Well, they obviously did something wrong, because you don't have a punishment unless something wrong was done. But Moses clarifies for us, lest we think they weren't holy. They were even closer to God than you and I, Aharon. That's what Moses says to Aaron. He says, that's what God said, Be krovaya kadesh. I will be sanctified by those that are closest to me. Nadav and Avihu made a choice. We discussed it when we read that Parsha. They made a choice based on emotion. And emotion is not what we are supposed to lead with. We lead with intellect. If we make choices based just on emotion, then we're in danger, because today the emotion may be good, but tomorrow it might be bad. A person could be in a bad mood, make a bad choice that they could regret. And Nadav and Avihu, they felt a tremendous emotion, because on that day they saw the divine presence and they wanted to run and hug it. They wanted to embrace it. They wanted to be lifted up by it. And therefore they brought an extra sacrifice that they were not supposed to, because they made a decision based on emotion, but it was an emotion of love and closeness to God. And therefore Moses says to Aaron, they are even closer to God than we. But God is particular with those who are closest to him, like the thread of a hair. And therefore, since they didn't live up to their fullest potential, therefore they sacrificed their lives, and their potential was beyond anything we can imagine. And I think we can say the same thing about the holy people who perished at Meron. They could have been going to the beach. They didn't go to the beach to celebrate. They didn't go to a discotheque to have a white night and party. They came to sing praise to God and to hug the Shekhinah, to hug the divine presence. Just like Nadav and Avihu ran to hug the divine presence, so too the people came to Meron, to the tomb of the holy Tana, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, to sing songs of praise to the Lord on Lag BaOmer. Very, very unspeakably holy. And yet they perished. And this is this time of the year. We have to be who we are. Now, as for the original question that I was going to ask, why is it that this chapter of Emor, which deals with the rules of the priests, is at the end of the book of Leviticus? I should think it would be at the beginning. It's after two chapters that have nothing to do with the priests. Now, the beginning of the book of Leviticus deals with the sacrifices. Now, that's the work of the priests. The book of Leviticus is called Torat Kohanim, the laws of the Kohanim. So it should be about the Kohanim. So it starts off okay with the sacrifices. That's the job of the Kohanim. And it goes okay into the leprosy, or whatever tzara'at is to be translated as, which the Kohen has to identify and declare impure and pure. and then it goes on to the service of Yom Kippur, which is the Kohen, which the Kohen is the star of, basically. So that is all good. But then we have the illicit sexual relationships that are forbidden at the end of Parshat Acharei Mot, which has nothing to do with the Kohanim per se. It's about the whole Jewish people are forbidden these things. And then the Parsha of Kedoshim talks to the whole Jewish people. Wonderful mitzvot. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Have awe and respect for your parents. Keep the Sabbath. Don't swear falsely. Don't steal. What has that got to do with the Kohanim? And then only after that we get the rules of the Kohanim, who they can become defiled to the dead for and who not, who they can marry, who they can't marry. That should be at the beginning of the book of Leviticus, not after Acharei Mot and Kedoshim, which have nothing to do with them, but rather we see here a very powerful lesson as well. It's about being who you are, and who are you? You don't have a status that's given to you externally. Your status comes from your actions, from what you do. That creates the who you are, and I think that's the implicit message here. I once knew a Kohen who had terrible interpersonal skills, was fighting, and yet insisted on being respected because I'm a Kohen. That's not the goal. As we learned, the Kohen, to be a Kohen, has to be a person of peace. But how does the Kohen get to that status? By deeds. Therefore, the Torah starts the book of Leviticus not with who the Kohen is and who he can marry and how he has to protect his honor, but rather what his job is. And his first job is to bring sacrifices, which brings peace between Israel and our Father in heaven. And the next job is to deal with the people who have this skin condition, sarat, which is to help the individual Jew, to help each other, between man and his fellow. And then Yom Kippur, and then the Jewish people rise up. The job of the Kohen is to bring the Jewish people up so that they should be Kedoshim, they should be holy, so that they should live up to the status, to the ethics, to the requirements of Parashat Kedoshim. And only then has the Kohen earned his status. And that's why Emor comes at the end. So we need to be who we are, proud of who we are. And who are we? Mamlechet Kohanim Goy Kadosh, a nation of priests, a holy nation. Shavua Tov.